Welcome back to another UNC basketball podcast here on TarHeelIllustrated.com. And if you're checking us out on our extremely fast-growing YouTube channel that is called Tar Heel Illustrated, we're right around the corner from 10,000 subscribers. Make Jacob Turner happy. If you're not a subscriber, click the subscribe button right now so we can creep toward 10,000. This is a March Madness edition, pre-Sweet 16, post-demolition of Marquette and escape against Baylor edition here on the THI basketball podcast. Joining me is our unbelievable analyst. If you have not read his film studies and his film reviews, then you're foolish. It's only $8.33 to subscribe to THI. It's $8.33 a month for a one-year subscription, and you get all of David's amazing brilliance when it comes to the sport of basketball. But David Sisk, longtime AAU college and high school basketball coaches, always on here with us when we do long-form basketball podcasts talking about the Tar Heels. And David, you and I last did one, I guess it was before the ACC tournament, and the Tar Heels were coming off a win at Duke, and I think you and I both said, look, they showed a high end we hadn't seen yet, and we'll find out in the next couple of weeks if that's who they're becoming or if that was just a one-off. And it looks to me like a couple of weeks into it, they have the demolition of, and it's twice I've used that word now, of Virginia. They were tired against Virginia Tech. It wasn't that big a deal. And then look what they did to Marquette, and for 30 minutes against the defending national champion Baylor. So your thoughts on North Carolina's trajectory and where you think this team is now that the Tar Heels are a few days away from playing UCLA in the Sweet 16?
Well, let's get that loss out of the way because it's kind of on my mind because we probably had a 15-minute chat before we came on the air here, and you're asking me, about some SEC teams. What happened to Auburn? What happened to Kentucky? What happened to some of these other teams? And the bottom line was, with other things, they kind of peaked and they were exposed and didn't play as well down the stretch. So some of these teams, you take like Auburn lost in the opening round of the SEC tournament, and you could just see it kind of falling apart there. Kentucky lost to Tennessee in the semifinals, and you could just see the perimeters couldn't create. North Carolina lost to Virginia Tech in the semifinals, and my take was they just had a bad game. It wasn't that big a deal. I felt like, Virginia Tech was I thought played over their heads that game. But even in that, it wasn't like kind of what we saw earlier in the year when North Carolina was old. They just didn't have it that night. And you saw against Virginia that they did. Against Marquette, going into that game, we really didn't know what could happen from watching a film. We knew what Marquette would do, but they were so kind of perimeter oriented, and then North Carolina. So that game could have went either way. And obviously, your point spread's like 2.5, 3 points, and obviously North Carolina just took them apart. I mean, just ravaged them. And one thing that was impressive there, not only they make shots, but Marquette's got some good offensive players, and they had some bigger perimeter players on smaller North Carolina perimeter players, and R.J. Davis and Caleb Love didn't budge that game. I mean, they've got 6'6" and 6'7" big physical guards backing them down the paint. Man, they're fighting them even after they catch the ball. And you start to see that fight, and then you see the offense just clicking. And then, like you said, we talked about in the pregame film that we did with Baylor. I'm not going to say going into the tournament. I thought Baylor was, because of the injuries, susceptible at that 1 seed. Jay Billis said they were the weakest 1 seed. I could go along with that, but that still doesn't mean it's an easy out. No. And as I watched the Baylor film that we did on the review there, on the film breakdown, it was obvious to me that the things that they gave up defensively was the things that North Carolina did well. The more I watched them against Kansas and some of these other games against Texas Tech, I'm sitting here thinking, man, North Carolina can beat them. And I'll tell you what, North Carolina really guarded them well. I thought pretty well the whole game. The big part, Manick has the ejection, Love fouls out right behind them. Baylor kicks the press in, they get them rattled, they make the run, but they got a lot of those points off turnovers and then tough shots down at the end. Overall, I felt like North Carolina's defense has come a long way.
Yeah, I thought the job that Leaky Black did on Justin Lewis for Marquette was unbelievable. Then the job he did on Meyer from Baylor he had one open look and he knocked it down. This was in the first half. He had an open look and knocked down about midway through. But I mean, Leaky was phenomenal. There's so many areas where we can start because honestly, I'm sitting there covering that game on Saturday, especially, and 10 minutes left, they're up 25, and I have a lot of stuff written. I'm thinking, gosh, this team I cover is about to beat the defending national champs and the number one seed, and I'm going to spend the last 6 minutes of the game with my face buried in my laptop writing. I won't even watch the game. And then everything changes. And
Can I ask you a question? Can I ask you what's on my mind?
Yeah.
What was going – because I'm telling you, I have a lot of friends here that are not North Carolina fans. They're not Baylor fans. They're not college basketball addicts. They like the sport and they watch March Madness. And that's like a lot of people do. College basketball becomes big in the month of March. And I'm telling you, they were riveted by that. I mean, it was a national story when it come back and the way that game finished. What was going through your mind the last 10 minutes?
I'll be honest with you. I don't root.
Courtside, because you're there. You're courtside.
Yeah, I don't root. I've been an impartial journalist for 26 years. I don't root. Now, there are times where I like kids and I like teams. And I can be happy for teams that I cover when they win. When the 2017 Tar Heels got their redemption from the year before, I felt really happy for those kids because I was in the locker room 15 minutes after Chris Jenkins' shot went through, and I talked to kids when they were in tears. Bryce Johnson had to wait like 5 minutes because he was crying. And so the next year I'm in that locker room and I love the whole story that they got their redemption. So there are kids that I like. There are teams that I like. I could be happy for the people that I cover because you get to know them a little bit, but I never root. But in this game, when that thing got under 10 points, I started thinking to myself, man, I really don't want to ask these kids questions about blowing the biggest blown lead in the history of the NCAA tournament and the history of this program. After all the stuff that they had done in recent weeks with stuff coming together, the anti-Hubert Brigade had gone silent. The anti-Caleb Love Brigade had gone silent. Brady Manick becoming this cult of Brady Manick thing going on. They had become a very fun and interesting team to cover. And suddenly to see that happen, I'm thinking, man, this is not going to be fun. It's going to be a challenge. But I was thinking that this is the most amazing thing. When the game ended, I texted a few people. I may have texted you. I'm not sure, you and Dean, in that little thread that we have. And I said, this is the most incredible thing craziest thing I've ever covered. I've done about 1,900 college basketball games. I've been doing college football all this time. I've done NFL. I've done NBA. I did Stanley Cup Game 7, the Stanley Cup Finals. And that was the craziest thing I'd ever covered because the first 30 minutes was compelling. That this North Carolina team that I saw in person looked just pathetic quite a few times was literally beating the snot out of a number one seed defending national champions 80 miles from their campus when 90% of the building was against them. Because remember, there were Kansas and Creighton fans in there, and they were rooting for Baylor as well, by the way. And then all of a sudden, the bottom falls out like I've never seen it fall out in any game I've ever covered before. And the thing that made it, that topped it, David, is that not only that Carolina won, but they won with Dontrez Styles and Justin McCoy on the floor. Yeah. They somehow found a way to win when their only perimeter shooter for a long stretch of that game, when they didn't need a lot of buckets, but they needed enough buckets because each time they scored, that forced Baylor to have to do that much more to complete the comeback. Their only shooter was their only ball handler. I think Leaky probably should have gone on the ball and RJ come off there for a while to make it a little bit more difficult to defend, but that didn't happen. And they managed to grit that thing out in the end. I said in our podcast, our three things, that I just watched a team build up a 25-point lead on the national champions and steal the game. And that's what they did.
Watching on television, you could feel it was one of those situations where you could feel it like you were there.
Yeah.
And it reminds, there's very few events that it's that way, but you felt like I've got a seat right there. And when it got to overtime, obviously there was nobody. You could have took everybody in America that thought North Carolina was going to win that game, and you wouldn't have had enough people to disturb the peace, as my dad used to say. And
stick in a phone booth.
I'm telling you. So
nobody on press row did. I talked to about 4 people on press row. I'm sorry to interrupt. Just to add to what you're saying, talked to about 4 people on press row, and we all said that they would lose between 10 and 15. I didn't think there was a chance in hell that they would win that game.
I felt like when the tip went up, I could watch Baylor on that first defensive possession, and I said, they've taken a breath.
Yep, sense of urgency was gone.
It was like it happened, and they had exhaled, or they had inhaled rather, and they were yet to exhale. They were just like, for about the first minute and a half, then about the 3.5 minute mark, they kind of kicked it back in. But North Carolina, I thought, did a great job. You got to give Hubert Davis, the players, credit. They were composed. They were the most composed people in the building, going into that overtime session. It was like nothing. They weren't rattled. And like I said, I just think Baylor backed off just enough, and then it gave North Carolina that confidence. And once again, Baylor had to do what they had to do the whole game. They had to play from behind. And this time they didn't have it.
The tension in the building was palpable. And what I thought was really interesting, and we're recording this Monday evening. Finally, Monday afternoon, earlier today, I got a chance to watch the replay because, when you're there covering NCAA tournament, they don't show replays of anything remotely controversial in the building. And they don't equip the media with a bunch of monitors or anything like that. So a lot of people watching at home are seeing replays of things that we don't see, especially some of the controversial stuff. And we'll get into the Manic thing here in a few minutes. But in watching the replay, and I remember seeing in person, because I just mentioned the Kansas and Creighton people were rooting against Carolina. Because still, when North Carolina and Baylor are on the court playing basketball, there's the blue blood and there's the new guys still, even though they're defending champs. And I thought it was interesting that the tension even spilled over into the fans of the next game. They were on their feet yelling. The Creighton dance team was screaming and yelling and pointing and stuff. It was unbelievable. And it was awesome at the same time because one of the beauties of the NCAA tournament is the raw emotion. The emotion of the victory, the emotion of loss, and the ebb and flow of emotions leading up to that. Watching the TCU-Arizona game last night was a classic example of that. The emotion in that game and in the stands was unbelievable. But the emotion that I got to experience firsthand, emotion around me, except those of us with laptops in front of us, we're the only people without emotion in the whole building, was one of the most incredible elements that I've ever been in a sporting event of any kind. I've seen some really cool stuff, like I said, covered some and seen some as a spectator. And to me, the amazing story is that they won that game. North Carolina had never lost an NCAA tournament game that they led by double figures at halftime. They were 44-0, and they blew a 25-point lead in 10 minutes, and they still won the game. And they won it with Justin Jackson playing the last 10 minutes Justin McCoy playing the last 10 minutes of the game. And by the way, he played very well defensively in the overtime period. And Dontrez Styles got 9 more minutes than he had gotten in any game in his Carolina career. He'd only had 5 double-figure minute games going into it. And that 3 he hit early in overtime, I think that relaxed the Tar Heels. I think that the message that Hubert gave them, telling them you're going to win this game, when he hit that 3, I think they fully believed it. And even though I think Baylor tied it at 84, going back and watching it and watching the body language on TV a second time, Tar Heels knew they were going to win that game. It's incredible what Hubert told them. He learned from the master, Dean Smith. There used to be some of the players that have played for Dean have said in the past, and there's different versions of it. They'd say, sometimes when they were on the road, another team's on a 12-2 run, and there'd be a timeout, and Dean would gather the team, and the place is going crazy. He'd say, there's a billion Chinese that couldn't care less about what's going on here. And it would kind of ease him. We kind of bring him into reality. Like, okay, this is super important, but it's not the most important thing in the world. Sun's coming up tomorrow. There are other obligations in life. Whatever Hubert said had to come from a moment sitting on the bench, being one of those kids at UVA or at Duke or State or Maryland, when Dean gave that line. Somehow that connection found its way into that huddle at the end of regulation and before overtime, because whatever he said, and they gave us a few versions of it the other day, relaxed those kids, and it was a stroke of genius.
I think sometimes when the coaches have the it factor, they just, they have that way to communicate, and I think a coach that can make his players believe.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we've seen because let's face it, North Carolina, after the Wake Forest game, and they've had it a couple of times this year, they've had two different stretches where they were at the abyss. And then you lose to Pitt at home, you know, and that but they just kept battling. And I know this, obviously everybody knows who G.G. Jackson is. And as I've talked to his dad throughout this recruiting process, Bishop, you know, when things were going bad, we'd spoken. I said, you know, do teams, if one team's playing well and having a great year and the other team's not having a great year, is that going to impact? I didn't mention teams' names, but I said, is that going to impact where he would go? And he said, no. He said, I'll give you an example. He said, Hubert Davis, those guys are playing for him. And he had said it back in late January. He said, man, those guys are playing. I feel like they're playing hard. They're playing for him. Man, they just keep battling. And that's kind of what's happened. You know, this is not the first time this team's back's been against the wall. And, you know, and it was much more, I'm trying to think of the word, agree. I don't think egregious would be the word, but it was to the point of no return earlier in the year where you didn't think they were going to make the NCAA tournament or anything. So they had a lot more to lose. And, you know, they kind of kept the faith. And one thing I kept thinking when they won the game was you think of it, and now the games may not seem like a whole lot, or then they may not have what they do now. But you talk about, you said that Louisville win on the road was in a hostile environment as you've ever been in. And then, you know, they had a tough game at Virginia Tech. That game at Clemson went down to the very last plays. One team would go ahead, then another team would go ahead, then another. And when you talk about Virginia Tech, even though Virginia Tech won the ACC tournament, and Clemson and Louisville, neither one of those teams got into the tournament, you may not think about great teams, but they won tough road games and tough environments. So I think this team did everything they could do to roughen up their hide a little bit. You know,
I think that's what they needed. David, we knew they had skill individually. That's what we kept chronicling all the 20-point scores they had. They had a stretch there. I think the first 15 games, they had at least one guy with 20 points. So we knew the skill was there. We knew that individual parts, there was a lot of stuff there. And I think that's what frustrated a lot of fans. But to win in basketball, as you know, as a guy who played and a guy who's coached for a long time at various levels, there's a lot of other stuff that needs to come together. And I think when they went to Louisville on February 1st and they won that game in the manner that they did, and I think one of the key moments of the season was Caleb having that terrible turnover at the end of regulation and then hitting a three right at the start of overtime. That was when we started seeing crunch time Caleb come into form. And that gives a team confidence. And when you win close games, a coach gets a little bit more relaxed about his team during the course of a game. And I thought there were times early in the year, Hubert it looked like he was just coaching to win that segment between one TV timeout and the next TV timeout. And I think as they started to win close games, he started to relax on his team. And I think they started to get a lot of trust in one another on both ends of the court. And Armando pointed out in Fort Worth that a lot of it was trust, not just on offense, it was trusting on defense. And, you know, they have gotten better defensively. They're not great defensively a lot of the time, but they make plays. They're blocking more shots. They're getting more steals. They're getting in passing lanes a little bit more. They're still going to give up looks and that kind of thing, but they're creating more havoc defensively. They're making things a little bit more difficult. And a lot of that is communication. I actually sat right behind Hubert in the Marquette game, and I got to hear a lot of the communication, and I could hear the bench calling out ice when Armando was calling out ice on the court when they were on defense. I mean, that was as engaged as I've seen a team in a first-round NCAA tournament game. Now, I've been close to benches in regional finals, Sweet 16s, even the Final Four, but I haven't been that close for a first-round game. And even when they're up 25, the bench was totally dialed in. So the process of the season and going through the stuff that they'd been through together, and here they are going into March, and they put themselves in a tube the week of the Duke game when all the attention is Duke, all the hoopla is Coach K and Duke, and they just got into a little tube together and deflected everything. And I think that was the final layer of having the right kind of mental toughness, because they ignored everything and they went in there on their own personal mission. And I think that's when it became about them more than any time earlier in the season. That to me is the ultimate signature moment for this team, because that's when they learned how to win with each other and for each other more than earlier in the year.
Yeah, and I heard several commentators over the weekend on ESPN and CBS and all the TBS, TNT, all those, talk about how this team really came together. They felt like we're a different team after Duke. And there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, you go back the last 3 weekends, they've won at Duke on the Coach K Day, and also they knocked off a 1 seed. And then they won the 8-9 game by 30 or 40, however much it was. So, I mean, you can't do much more than that. And it sounds crazy. If you the feedback that I get from people I talk to in everyday life here, as you know, I teach school and coach and all that. So people won't talk about basketball that I'm around. And you wouldn't believe how many people, like I said, they don't have any skin in the business here. And they're like, hey, North Carolina could go to the Final Four and win this whole thing the way they're playing. So, I try to sit back and think, okay, who is it? Is there a team that I'm looking at right now that's been the most impressive? Who was like a UNLV when they won it, were beating everybody by 30 or 40 all the way through the tournament. Is there a team? And I don't know that there is, but I would say this. I watched Gonzaga play at Memphis. They trailed the whole game. Kansas has been in some tight games, and they really haven't played as a strong team yet, in my opinion. Arizona basically stole one last night against TCU. And those are your yeah. So those are your 1 seeds. Are any of those 1 seeds playing better than North Carolina? I don't think so. I think North Carolina is playing as good as anybody in this tournament or better. And that I don't know what that means as far as on down the road. Does that mean they win a national championship? We'll see. But I would put the quality of play that they're doing. It's all about a matchup. So when you got to play a team Thursday night or Friday night and you're a coach, you don't look at that and say, man, we're playing a 1 seed. You take that team, you look at what they do, you scout that team, you try to put your players in positions where they can succeed, and it's just 5 guys against 5 guys. And if I was another coach, I think I would look at North Carolina and say, those 5 guys we're getting ready to play are playing as good as anybody in the country.
The 3 most talked about college games in the last 16 days were Kentucky losing to St. Peter's, and then North Carolina's win at Duke, and North Carolina's game against Baylor. And CBS got very fortunate that they stuck that in its own time slot. And a bunch of people that I know that aren't really basketball fans, they'll watch the tournament. They'll be in a tournament pool and that kind of thing. I got a lot of messages from a lot of people. Like, that was incredible. That was amazing. Holy crap, what a game. I've never seen a team melt down and win like that. I thought it was fascinating. And, the 2 Carolina games that are in those 3 that we're talking about a team that had to be mentally unbelievably off the charts in order to win in both times. And what were we talking about earlier in the year that was a significant weakness? It was their mental strength, their mental fortitude a lot. They got punched at home against Duke, and Leakey said we didn't punch back. They go to Coral Gables, and they're just not ready to play. Wake goes on a run. LaRavia hits a couple of shots. They don't get up and fight back. All that stuff looks like it's gone. Like, that's not who they are anymore. It's like a football team running through the goalpost and busting through one of those big signs that the cheerleaders make. They busted through that stuff, and they've left it in their rearview mirror.
I think the thing that fans hate more than anything, they hate coach speak. So when coach says, hey.
So do sports writers.
I know. We're going through the process. And people just roll their eyes. But trust me, coaches, that's the holy grail. It's the process. And they don't even care about the sausage. They want to be in there making it. They don't care, at the end, because, Larry Brown used to say he wished they didn't play a great North Carolina player. he wishes that, he said, I would rather practice than play. I don't even enjoy the games. I enjoy the practice.
Stress.
Yeah. And of course you're tried by fire through the games.
Yep.
But I'm telling you, the process, it just didn't happen that North Carolina changed not only on the court, but maybe more important, mentally and psychologically. It's the process that they had to go through, and the tough times truly made them, and they matured, and they just kept chopping wood. That's a term that they use, man. They just stayed at it and stayed at it and stayed at it. And sometimes that switch just flips. And how many, we've already talked about some teams. How many teams I'll give you another team. Michigan was in worse shape than North Carolina.
Yeah. And they had the national embarrassment.
When they came, before that, North Carolina beat them in January and in December. I guess it was December.
It was December 2nd, I think. Pounded.
I said, this is the worst Michigan team I've seen in 20 years. They're not athletic on the perimeter. They can't score. They can't make shots. No, Hunter Dickinson had a bad game. He was in foul trouble. And he's a big difference maker. But I looked at them and I said, man, it's a bad team. So I couldn't believe they got in the tournament. It blew my mind. And then I'm like, here's the thing. The Michigan team, when I did a bracket, and the Michigan team I had on my mind is not the March Michigan team. It was the December Michigan team. And I couldn't get that out of my mind. I'm like, they're awful. They can't beat anybody. So you look at North Carolina, and I think people, if you're in Philadelphia, where Villanova's at, or Tennessee, or Kentucky, or Miami, or I won't say Winston-Salem, they say them all the time. So you're doing a bracket, you remember that, and you're like, hey, North Carolina can't beat anybody. Did you see them? And then on the other end, you've got all these teams, your Kentuckys, your Auburns, all these teams that peaked in December and January and just couldn't keep it going. Whereas you got the other end, you've got the teams that just kept working and getting better and getting better. And this has shown me, and I'll forget it by this time next year, but I hope you remind me that it's a process. You hear it all the time. Don't get too high, don't get too low. And it's never truer than now because, man, you can't panic in December, January, and you can't crown a national champion in December, January either.
My good buddy and one of our former photographers at THI, Bruce Young, reminded me today to stop referring to this big red wagon that the Tar Heels have been accumulating things and stacking it on in the last 6 weeks. I'll just call it to honor Bruce's request. It's a Carolina blue wagon or whatever. But they've been doing that. That's part of the process, is to accumulate as you go through the season. It's intel, it's adjusting, it's accumulating. Things happen and you move forward. And one of the things that happened to this team wasn't just losing Anthony Harris, but it was losing Dawson Garcia when he went back home. And Hubert was asked a question, I believe it was last Friday, about losing Garcia and the team, having to basically become sort of an Iron Five type thing, which they reject. They don't like that Iron Five motto. The starters don't. They all want to play every minute, but they don't like that motto. And I asked sort of a sideways follow-up to that. It was more specifically about Brady. I didn't really want to ask him about Dawson. I don't think there's any need to. And I said, to paraphrase, how much has Brady benefited from the fact he's on the court 35 minutes? And I didn't say he didn't have to look over his shoulder because, again, I didn't want to make it about Dawson. I want to make it about Brady. But the fact that you have him out there, how much a part of the cohesion that he's been talking about for a few weeks now, about them having tremendous cohesion, how much of that is the fact that Brady kind of jumped in there in late January as the 35-minute-a-game guy at that spot, and everything has come together because of that? And he said, absolutely. He said that we need Brady on the court for 35 minutes. That's the team they need to be. So sometimes addition by subtraction, and this isn't, again, to denigrate Dawson, but if you're going to have one of those two guys on the floor for 35 minutes, I think that Brady Manick and what he brings to the table, especially the way his game has grown and blossomed in the last 6 weeks, the way that he plays off, it used to just be Armando, remember? Now it's RJ, now it's Caleb, now it's Leaky. They are a much better team because Brady Manick's game has absolutely exploded in the last month.
Yeah, and Brady, and I think all these guys are reminiscent of a running back that's got to touch it 20 times. He's got to work out. Or a boxer that's got to get into about the 7th or 8th round before he starts warming up. He starts getting the feel. And it's amazing because, as you know, many people know, I work with Kentucky side too on Rivals. They're in the same boat where they didn't have much of a bench, played 6 or 7 guys, and they lost their legs. I mean, they had 45% shooters shooting 20% at the end of the year. In total, and I feel like they're wore down. North Carolina was in the same thing where you're playing these guys long minutes. And I've seen other teams too play guys deep, no bench, long minutes, playing 37, 38 minutes again and wore down. And somehow North Carolina's not done that. And that's the interesting thing to me. I don't know that Hubert Davis, if you ask him, and I may be wrong on this, I don't know if he would have an answer to that. But if you get a chance to ask him, I'm very curious how, they're playing those extended minutes in a long season, but they have not lost legs. I wonder, too, if there's an advantage on the ACC starting on early in the week as they do and having the finals on Saturday compared to a lot of these other ones having finals on Sunday. So North Carolina got knocked out Friday night. They got to rest. So they had about a week off. And I don't know that you can underestimate that.
Yeah.
I am not – we talked about this before the ACC tournament, if you'll remember. And remember I asked you what's most important for North Carolina? Is it winning the ACC tournament or making a deep NCAA tournament run? Do you remember me asking you that?
Yeah. I said win whatever you could win. If you could win the tournament now, you go ahead and do that.
But you even mentioned then, well, they may have an advantage. The ACC may have an advantage. They get that extra day. When I watch some of these teams playing wars and going to Sunday, they have tough quarterfinal games, tough semifinal games, tough final games, and they're playing 3 games in a row, and they're finishing on Sunday, and they're turning around playing Thursday after 3 wars within 72 or within 48 hours, really.
Yeah.
Maybe that's it. Maybe North Carolina had a good break. And like I said, if you give me the druthers, I would rather make a deep run in the tournament and go out on Friday. So maybe that worked for them. But like I said, it's been very interesting. Manick, no doubt, has had freedom. He knows he's going to get to play. He's not looking over his shoulder. He's playing with total confidence. I don't think guys in that they know that they can make mistakes and play through them and not worry about getting pulled out.
Yeah.
I think that's a big issue. But like I said, who knows I'm just interested that how they did not lose their legs through this, playing those extended minutes. And maybe, who knows, that Virginia Tech loss in semifinals might have been the best thing that ever happened to them.
Well, and Hubert said that night that they were tired. Their legs were tired. And he was asked for clarification if it was mental or physical. And he said, no, it's all just physical. I thought maybe it was mental too because of how much they had to.
What if they would have wanted to play Duke in an emotional rematch?
Yeah, I'm not sure we'd see this. And
then, because I've watched –
especially since they were in the Thursday, Saturday first weekend.
Iowa wins the Big Ten tournament, gone.
Yep. Tennessee gone.
So
Arizona was almost gone last night. They won the Pac-12. Well, let me answer your question by maybe asking a question at the same time. I'll ask the second part, and we're going to talk about the Manick situation against Baylor in a couple of minutes. But I do want to hit on this because it's a really good point, and we actually have a press conference in Chapel Hill Tuesday. And if I remember, I think I might ask Hubert this question or around what you're asking about. When you brought up Kentucky, for example, not having much of a bench, Kentucky didn't really, from my vantage point, I'm much further away from it, obviously, than you are. Didn't look like Kentucky improved a whole lot from the middle of January on.
Got worse.
And when that happens, the season becomes a bit of a grind, so the legs get heavier. Carolina, on the other hand, they had some change because they lost Harris, then they lost Garcia, then they started finding themselves. And even though they got punched against Duke, I think that they didn't feel like, well, we can't compete with them. They realized that was on us. And then the Pitt game, and I asked Hubert about this last week, which I think was the final important lesson that this team experienced. Hubert said that the day after the Pitt game, that he showed the team 20 clips of them doing stuff in that game that they had never been coached to do. So their heads just weren't in it. So it wasn't so much about who they were as a team. It's about how they approached that game because Pitt was in town, right? And they just kind of they still had to learn a little bit more lesson about how front of your jersey doesn't score baskets. You got to score the baskets no matter what jersey you're wearing. And I think that was a good lesson for them. But they have been ascending. So they're having more fun because they're playing better. They're more connected. And when you're connected, you give each other energy. And I think that they're lifting each other up by the way they're playing. So because they're playing so well, they're not feeling it as much because they are on some sort of adrenaline type run. They're getting fuel that maybe wouldn't have been there if they were struggling a little bit more, like a team like Kentucky did down the stretch.
And we talk a lot about Hubert playing for Dean Smith, coaching under Roy, but his lineage in the NBA with Don Nelson, Pat Riley, all that, and many others. It's a who's who. Yeah. And if you can't learn under those situations, then you've missed a great opportunity. And I think he's got a lot of ingenuity. The way he connects motivationally, like you say, showing these clips. And one thing he said after the game, I don't know if you saw the interview or not, but I'm sure he said the same thing in the press conference that you covered. He wanted the North Carolina player, he wanted those players to have their moment, as North Carolina players that they could share for the rest of their lives. That, this was this great moment in North Carolina basketball history happened while I was out there on the court. Well, this was a great moment for me. So that's a guy who understands the program. It wouldn't be like hiring me as a head coach and me trying to relay playing in the high school district tournament semifinals or something. He knows. And all those guys, Jeff Lebo, Sean May, and the rest of those guys, man, they've had huge success in North Carolina uniforms. They've been North Carolina lifers. They understand the process. So I think this is one time, too, you can look at it and say hiring inside the family, having a staff inside the family. A lot of people knock it, but I think it's one of those times where it worked because I think they know what's going through those players' minds. And more importantly, I think they know what they want those players to feel from their own experiences.
I think it's why they hire within the family, because it's such a unique thing that it's very difficult for others to understand. And that's what makes the Brady Maddox story so interesting. And by the way, very quick sidebar, then we're going directly to Brady. Hubert was 6 years old and he was riding in a car with Olympians who were also Tar Heels, Phil Ford, his uncle Walter Davis, Tommy Lagarde, Mitch Kupchak, to the Olympics. And they won the gold medal. And the head coach was Dean Smith. And one of his assistants was Bill Guthridge. So Hubert has been ensconced in this for his entire life. He's 51 years old. He'll be 52 this summer. He was around 6 years old, just turned 6 years old when he did that. That's what he knows. That's who he is. If you cut him, his basketball DNA that comes out has a lot of components to it, which I think actually makes him intriguing. It's not just Carolina, but man, the first trace that comes out is Carolina blue. And it's Carolina blue basketball done the way that Carolina has done things. That's what takes me back to whatever he told those kids at the end of regulation. That's a Dean Smith type moment. And that's what the kids were saying. And to hear the kids talk about him, we've all wondered. There were times we've all wondered, man, is this working? Is this the right guy for the job? But at the same time, like when you and I've had conversations without the record button on, you got to give people time. And you got to give them more time than just this 1 year. This is just one season. But we are seeing some of the patience of the process and his daily messaging start to pay off. Because, you ever watch that that series, the food that built America. No one just, made cornflakes one day and they were the biggest cereal distributor in America the next day. It's a process. They have to have some failures. They got to fall on their rear end every once in a while so they can really learn who they are and what the right course of action is. And certainly this coach and this team has had those experiences this year, and they find themselves where they are right now. If you want to comment on that, go right ahead. Then we'll get on to the Brady Manic stuff.
There's two things, and I'll say quickly. I think it's great that you have somebody who understands all this, like I said, but he's not going to say, all right, Roy, give me your playbook, and I'm going to be you, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. He's changed. I think and I've said this, I think he is such a good offensive coach. And besides all the other stuff that we mentioned, so, and I know this, there are people that I've talked to that follow other programs closely and are going, gosh, we wish we had a stretch guy like Brady Manic. It takes so much so they are really running a modern day offense. But the other thing is too, I think this is very important in North Carolina history that they have this run right now, because now Hubert's got, I think, a little bit of a comfort zone where he can do his thing and they'll let it happen. Because you go back and think, Nebraska football is being patient now, but they weren't very patient with Frank Solich. They fired him for winning 10 games. Alabama never let Ray Perkins and those guys coach. There was so much pressure. Gene Bartow, Larry Brown, those guys were never allowed to coach at UCLA. They're falling under that shadow. And it's tough, but I think when you have this success, people buy in. And now I think Hubert's in a situation now where they let him coach. And I think that's big.
And you've been saying since November that you like the way he coaches offense, but the defensive measurables have improved. The rebounding numbers, the offensive rebounding has improved. They're getting more steals now, which was an enormous problem for up until about 3 weeks ago. There's a lot of little things are ticking in the right direction in statistical categories. Okay, so Brady Manic the other day, from my vantage point, when I'm on the baseline opposite Carolina, like I'm on the sideline, but I'm right at about where the baseline is. And I just saw stuff happen because stuff was happening a lot in this game and it was getting pretty chippy. And Sohan was chippy from the outset in the game from the first time he stepped on the floor. And so the refs are reviewing stuff. It's a 25-point game. I'm not thinking it's that huge a deal, but I'm watching Carolina's bench because I see one of the officials go over and start talking. And you could see Jeff Leba's like, what are you talking about? And Hubert didn't have any reaction. I thought, because I saw Armando go like this, just kind of like do something with his body. I thought, man, they just throw Armando out? Because I thought the way the ref was talking to him, and I've seen guys get kicked out before, it looked to me like someone was kicked out. And then Brady just kind of flails his arms down, just walks off the court, goes to the tunnel with Eric Hoots. And by the way, Eric Hoots spent the entire time with Brady in the locker room. He was never left alone. Hoots is a director of operations, been around the program for, since around the time that Roy got there, even before when he was a student. So he spent that whole time with Brady. And then we watched the team melt down. Now, before we talk about the meltdown, and don't want to go too long into that, I didn't see the replay until about an hour after I did the Three Things podcast with Jacob. So I had no idea. Nobody in the building did. And the PA announcer said flagrant 2. And a lot of people weren't even sure if that meant he was ejected. I was talking to people behind me who at least could maybe watch on their cell phones or see something. I was texting people saying, what are the TV announcers saying? Because the refs will tell the TV announcers what's going on so they can tell the audience at home. Problem is the people who paid money to be in there and who are working in there don't know exactly what's going on. Obviously, he was ejected. When I went and looked at the replay, his elbow was up pretty high and it was kind of swinging, but he was also in the process of boxing out. And if you're in a box out situation, as you well know, and it's not just a body on body, a lot of things can happen when there's not the even, one guy pressing against the other guy. And there was movement here. So stuff happens when that happens. To me, it looked like this should have been a flagrant 1. It was a flagrant 2. He was ejected. And in less than a minute, Baylor scores 9 points, and I think the Tar Heels completely lost their poise. There were some bad calls that kind of helped Baylor along the way. And next thing you know, that's the most tense environment I've ever been in. So what did you see during that sequence?
No, first of all, is it Sohan? How do you pronounce his name again?
Sohan, yeah.
Sohan. He's an instigator. And I tweeted during the game, there's no doubt in my mind his role model's Dennis Rodman. And I don't say that in jest. He colors his hair. He plays like him. He's built like him. His style reminds me of Dennis Rodman. I mean, the way, even when he has the ball, so much of him reminds me of Dennis Rodman. And when I saw him go down on the floor, it seemed like how many times he went down on the floor of another North Carolina player. It reminded me of Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone, you know, in the championship series. It really did. You know, there was the one time in the first half where he's got Armando Baycott's leg wrapped around his. I mean, he's got it squeezed and he won't let go when Baycott falls. And it was just like those shenanigans all the time. I think he got under their skin. And I can see it either way. Well, Manic, if he got to flagrant 1, I can see that. If he got to flagrant 2, I think the thing was when he turned, you could see Manic turn and see him before that elbow. I think that's what got him. I think when the referees looked at that, I could see that one going either way. I mean, I don't think he meant to hurt him or anything like that. I think he made a physical play, obviously, but I think Sohan is an agitator, and I think he got under everybody's skin.
I think there's a belief. I think there's a belief that had this been a 6-point game at the time, that the F2 wouldn't have been called. That the refs sensed that, sort of like in hockey, you know, when you have a hockey series, it's 3-0, and the team that's down 3-0 in the series is losing 3-0 in the third period, they're going to start gooning it up, right? And Baylor had already been kind of gooning up a little bit, especially Sohan. I think the officials thought, okay, we got to make a point out of this. We still got 10 more minutes to play. And defending champs #1 seed, with their fans here who are kind of agitated throughout the game, we got to make a point here. And they figure, well, you toss the guy, they're up 25, it's not that big of a deal. Something along those lines is what a lot of people who know a thing or two believe was probably the thinking by the officials. But what was bizarre about all that was how, if they were going to call that to kind of stem the chippiness, then there was a lot of other stuff that wasn't called. It's like the way the game was officiated changed a little bit at that time, but it wasn't very consistent. I think that made it difficult for some of the players. And we saw that on some of the pressing that Baylor did. Now, a lot of North Carolina fans have challenged me about my saying, look, refs don't blow 25-point leads. And I will go to my grave saying refs don't cost teams games. Teams do. Until a team plays a perfect game and loses because of the officials, then it's not the officials' fault. Teams have to learn how to adapt. Just like in baseball, if you got an umpire giving the pitcher the black and he's calling you out on strikes in the black, you got to adjust. And you have to adjust in basketball. But it is difficult to adjust with 10 minutes left in the game when things kind of shifted the way that they did. My takeaway of the last 10 minutes, David, is that Carolina lost their poise. Okay, there were some calls that didn't go their way, but there were a lot of calls that went their way up to that point, if you go back and watch the game. Because in the end, Baylor had one more foul call than Carolina did, and Carolina attempted 10 more free throws, and it wasn't like Baylor was intentionally sending them to the line a lot. So Carolina lost their poise. They've had issues earlier this year against presses, and they had issues again. And, until the 6:15 mark, they had Love, Black, and Davis on the floor. They had their ball handlers out there, and they were still having trouble.
Yeah, and look, here's the thing. I think it becomes huge when you don't have a deep bench. Those players become so important. If you're going 9 or 10 deep, and there's no difference of what leaves the floor and what comes on, then it's not an issue, or it's not as much of an issue. But like you say, when that's your 5 that you're going with, then it becomes huge, man. It's like losing a limb. And Manic, had Manic been on the floor, and I was telling the guy this today, I said, if Manic hadn't have been ejected, I said, North Carolina would have won by 20. I mean, I have no doubt about that. One thing Manic can do, his versatility, he's a 6'10" perimeter player offensively. So he can handle the ball, and it makes it really tough on the Baylor big to have to get up and guard that in the back court. That's a huge issue. The other thing, though, and you can't ever look over this, in the press, he's big. So at 6'10", he can see over the traps. And if you get that first pass out against Baylor, then you can really attack it. One thing I felt like, and I tweeted this at the 5 or 6 minute mark, when North Carolina did get it across, I think they went to the clock too much.
Yeah,
so Baylor is pressing, they're trapping anywhere. You're trying to hold it for 20, 25 seconds in the front court when every catch, every dribble, every pass is being trapped. And that's tough, man. So you've got, and if things worked out well, but I think you've got to attack. If you've got an open lane to the rim, you got to take it. If you got 2-on-1, you got to take it. And we know North Carolina's been susceptible to turnovers this year. So when you take Manic out, then you take Caleb Love out behind it, and Baylor's got that pressure. One thing Baylor did in that press, normally if you throw the ball into the middle, that's not where they want you to throw it in against the press, and you can beat it. But Baylor did a really good job of trapping the middle of the floor. That inbounds pass would come in, man, they'd trap it right under the goal. I was really impressed with that. There weren't a whole lot of pass fakes under that pressure. I saw North Carolina, they would just get it. They'd turn and do this. There was no looking off. There was no pass faking high to throw low or pass fake low to throw high. So I think there's a lot of things against the pressure that they can learn. Here's a good thing. I wouldn't get panicky about that. And I said this, that does not need to overshadow what North Carolina did to win the game, number one. But number two, UCLA is about the last team in this tournament that can do that can get out pressure. A full court press for UCLA is probably getting out and guarding 22, 23 feet from the rim.
Yeah.
And Purdue's about the same boat. So, if they get past, North Carolina probably wouldn't have to see this again until they got to the Final Four.
By the way, the Carolina had 10 turnovers in the last 10 minutes of regulation. 4 of them were charges, and that had nothing to do with bad calls. It was just out of control play. Baycott had one. Caleb had 2. Justin McCoy had one. They had 6 charges in the game that were it was just not smart plays by the Tar Heels, and that certainly had a factor. Before we look ahead very quickly to this coming week in Philadelphia, the value of them winning the way that they did, I think that in the end, and this goes back to my theme here for about a month now, they got this big freaking wagon behind them that they're pulling with them, and they stop and they pick stuff up as they attain new layers of their coat of armor and other things that they're bringing with them through the tournament that makes them more formidable each week. I think that they hoisted up a bunch of giant stuff and stuck it on that wagon in the manner that they won that game, because they were breathtaking for 30 minutes on both ends of the court. They were disastrous and survived it, and did it with 2 guys who don't play, but 2 guys who have had DNPs in the last month on the floor in that environment, in that setting, winning the game. I think this has got to make them have the most confidence that they've had at any time this year, but they had to be shaken enough that they can't go into Philadelphia thinking, we're back to being just North Carolina. That's who we are. Because enough stuff happened that Hubert could show them, look what happened to you. You guys almost blew a 25-point lead. And I guarantee he's not telling them that the referees made 9 bad calls and that was why. He's telling them that they blew a 25-point lead and almost lost. I think it's almost a perfect way for this team to go into the next week. Yeah.
And, you can get their attention through that. But I think also, I always saying pressure bursts pipes, but it makes diamonds. They won. I mean, look, they won that game in overtime when, like I said, the world was against them. So even though they were so impressive for 30 minutes of that game, maybe the overtime in that situation, that's what you can really build on, number one, to build that confidence. But the second thing is I just don't think you can win enough close games. The more you're successful in those type of situations, what happens if they beat Marquette by 40 and they beat Baylor by 25 or 30 and they get into UCLA, and it's a rock fight.
Yep, which is going to be. That's what UCLA wants.
Yeah, and I know that they've had these games before, but I don't know that they've had rock fights in the mode of a team like UCLA. The rock fights we talked about against Louisville, against Clemson, against Virginia Tech, none of those teams are going to be confused with Baylor.
No, those are just warm-ups.
You can be a number one team in that and find a way to win. You know, it's like when you watch football, and I'm going to admit it, I can't stand Alabama. And so when you watch Alabama play, and it doesn't matter who they play, I want that team to beat them. So, you know, that you go last year and you got the Florida game. If they kick extra point, they wouldn't had to go for 2 at the end. LSU running back gets run down inside the 10-yard line to tie the game. All Tank Bigsby for Auburn has to do is slide, and the game's over, and he runs out of bounds. So, yeah, I look at that and I say, you know, Alabama just always find – you thought that way. They always find a way to win. They just find – that's what the great teams do. They find a way to win. And North Carolina, I'm telling you, it's not measured on because you beat people by 100 every time you play them. It's doing things like that when the odds are against you, and they know knowing how to win is the most important intangible you can have.
That's why when people were complaining that they were struggling with Clemson and Louisville and Syracuse, I'm like, guys, the wins. You learn how to win. You learn how to trust each other. Going back, we opened up this podcast talking about. I think that is so invaluable. You get on the court when you have that, when you know that the other 4 guys on the floor totally believe in you, and they know you believe in them all the way around. It's so hard to get that in basketball sometimes. Unbelievably talented teams done it. We saw some teams lose the last several days that have been better throughout the year than a North Carolina or a Michigan, but may not have believed as much. They may not have been as connected this weekend. And you think about North Carolina and Michigan, both have gone through a lot of stuff, both on the court, and those Michigan kids had to deal with the embarrassment of what happened with their coach too. And isn't it kind of ironic that the one moment that we see of a coach this past weekend is Juwan Howard with Kennedy Chandler? It's amazing how college basketball in this tournament allows for redemption in the course of the same season like no other sport does. And we're seeing Michigan doing it, and more particularly because of who we cover, we're seeing North Carolina do it right before our eyes.
And North Carolina would kind of remind me, I'm sitting here watching Memphis and Gonzaga Saturday night, and Gonzaga's down 10. And I told my wife there, and she said, man, they may get beat. And I said, no, they're not going to get beat. They're going to make a run here. And once they get ahead, they'll put this game away. You watch them. And they've won so many games the past few years, and they've won big games. And, and now like a staple in the Final Four. So you get that confidence where you just expect to win, and you know how. And then you have it where the other team's not sure. And that's one big thing, too, I look at, too, is teams not knowing how to do it yet. So, to me, that's huge. North Carolina having the confidence to do that. And, didn't you feel like as the season went, like you're talking about those games, that they would be games like on Tuesday nights, we'd have a high school game. And I might go in a locker room, and I just might check my phone and see what score is, with a North Carolina game or whatever. And I would be there, and I'm like, what's a close game? I said, I expect them to win. I'm going to be very, very surprised if they don't, Even though the Pitt game was close and I was kind of keeping up with that score, I still was shocked that they didn't. Not because it was Pitt, but I just thought they would win a close game. And they kind of got that way at the end of the year, and you expect them to do it. So I think the confidence is there for that.
And they won close games by making plays. Caleb's dish to Brady at Clemson. Brady's feed, the three-way dish. It was RJ to Brady, the pump fake feed to Armando for the dunk against Louisville. The way that they won some of these games, Caleb wanting the ball in the last minute at Castle Coliseum, jawing with the students and like, give me the ball, let me shoot these free throws, let me ice it for us. You could see the growth. And now the growth and the toughness and some of the other intangibles of better rebounding, better offensive rebounding, better defense have come together with their skills. So moving forward, and we won't go too far into the future on this one because Jacob and I are going to do a preview pod for UCLA, and we'll do another thing when I'm in Philadelphia on Thursday. But when you look ahead at this bracket, you've got Carolina, UCLA, you've got Purdue, St. Peter's. I had no idea that Shaheen Holloway was the St. Peter's coach until a couple of days ago. I remember covering him when he was in the NCAA tournament, when he was at Seton Hall.
Shaheen Holloway.
You coach Shaheen Holloway?
Against Shaheen
Against
Holloway.
him.
Yeah, you tell I'm from New Jersey. Yeah, I coached against Shaheen Holloway.
I think I don't know much about St. Peter's. I'll get a chance to see them. I like to see teams in person for the first time. I like to check them off my list. I got San Diego State out of the way for about 15 minutes the other day, and I'll get St. Peter's out of the way this weekend. I guess that's going to excite nobody except me because I'm kind of a college basketball junkie. But going into this weekend, I think it's interesting that Carolina is going to get the team that they wanted in Vegas, but ended up not playing because UCLA had to back out the last couple of days because of a COVID situation. And I think that affected the Heels a little bit. They ended up getting blown out by Kentucky. And then they get Purdue, a team that they actually played pretty well against to the Mohegan Sun, but lost. Armando played 17 minutes that game. He was in foul trouble. And I say they get Purdue, assuming that Purdue beats St. Peter's. They just can't assume anything right now in the NCAA tournament. What do you think very quickly about looking ahead to this weekend, what Carolina needs to do? And do you think that there's a decent chance that they sneak through and they get to New Orleans for their 21st Final Four?
Number one, this is a bracket that has kind of gotten blown to bits a little bit.
Yeah.
Obviously the Kentucky, you've got your 1 seed, your 2 seeds are out. So, that clears the way a little bit. UCLA and North Carolina, I think it's the contrast is probably as big as it could get. The way North Carolina's offense, free flowing, a lot of possessions, kind of a high scoring, a lot of threes. UCLA, you can tell Mick Cronin's from the Midwest. Big Ten type. It's weird too. You talk about a team that knows how to win. I had Iowa State actually going to the Sweet 16. And the reason I had Iowa State is because LSU with Will Wade gone. I didn't see anything there. And I have no confidence in Wisconsin scoring 50 points a game. But you look at UCLA, and those games are constantly in the 50s and 60s, and they're low scoring, and they win. So North Carolina is playing a team. We talked about them knowing how to win. UCLA knows how to win. But, it's just going to be physical. It's going to be like playing Virginia. You talked about that a lot. I think that's the comparison, except they're much better offensively than Virginia. And you said, well, hold on, they don't score points. Well, they have these long possessions that they have. They work the shot clock down, and they go into isolation. So they'll find somebody that's got the mismatch, and they'll just throw the ball to them, and those other 4 guys go to the other side of the court. It's like old NBA offense back in the 90s.
Yeah.
You go back. that's all the NBA used to be was isolation basketball. It's not like it is now. And UCLA does. So, and defensively, very physical. They want to slow it down. So you've got North Carolina wanting to play fast, free-flowing, and you've got UCLA wanting to keep the thing really physical, keep it in half court, keep the score down. But the thing, if you're North Carolina that you've got, and it's kind of a catch-22 for teams, if they want to get that thing physical and slow, then they're playing Brady or Armando Bacot, rather. They're playing him on his terms. So I think that's and
they're not big, and they're not real big.
No.
But they have been there, done that, guys. A couple of those guys played a lot of minutes against Carolina in Vegas a few years ago.
Yeah.
Tiger Campbell's been around. Tiger Campbell's been around forever.
Yeah.
Jaquez, I don't know what his situation is going to be this week, but he's been around for a while. They've got nice parts and they're rugged. The thing that jumps out at me about UCLA, I'm not sure if you may have seen this game. I think we talked about it, when not recording here a few weeks ago, but when Arizona went to Pauley, that was a fascinating game because Arizona was off and running through the first TV time. I had like 16 points or something. And then the Wildcats scored 2 field goals in the next 10 minutes. It was like we've seen Virginia, like a cobra, just kind of strangle and just squeeze the breath out of teams, right? That's what UCLA did to Arizona. And I think of all the teams in college basketball this year, as good as Gonzaga looks at times, when Arizona's really going, they're maybe the most breathtaking team in the country. And UCLA made them look pedestrian. Now, they've lost to them twice since then, but the bottom line is this is a one-game situation. And that was also a home game. So that when they lost them before, it was on the road on a neutral site. But I think that's the kind of thing. If they could frustrate Carolina's guards, and if they can keep Manic from cutting as smoothly and stealthily as he does at times, that could create a lot of problems. If they turn Carolina into a dribble jump shooting team instead of a pass jump shooting team, I think that could be trouble for the Tar Heels.
But one thing about North Carolina, I think a huge key is going to be whether, and this has always been a big key for North Carolina this year, whether or not they make three-pointers from outside. Because here's the thing, UCLA will kind of sag it. And, Caleb and Manic, especially Caleb will step out 25, 26 feet and not think anything about it. And he can make the shots as long as he shoots them in the rhythm. And like you said, it doesn't become just a one-on-one dribble fest between the legs and behind the back into it. It's got to be done to flow the offense. So I think that's one huge key. And if they can make the outside shots, then they stretch them, then Baycott goes to work one-on-one. So, obviously, Mick Cronin, I think, is going to be looking at this game and saying, okay, we have got to make sure we contest threes. We can't sag, we can't help. If they're going to play a lot of help, North Carolina shooters get loose. Yep. So that's the thing. You talk about how UCLA likes to bump cutters. They like the help. They've got great help side. It's just, I just think it's hard to pack line North Carolina for making shots.
Yeah, Virginia learned that. Virginia learned that twice this year.
I think you almost have to play them straight up and extend it, not like Baylor did where you're giving them lanes. You're giving them the baseline and then letting them create from there. I think you've almost got to go out there and play them straight up and get in them. And I just don't see how you can play this thing without extending it. So I do think that North Carolina, the way they're playing, like I say, they're playing as good as anybody. I think they put pressure on UCLA defensively. I really do. Now, if they don't make shots from the outside, then it's going to be bad. It could really get tough because then you're playing UCLA's game, which they're extremely good at.
I think Armando could score in this game, though, David. But I think the concern going into this one is him picking up fouls while trying to get position because they're going to body the crap out of him.
Yeah.
They're going to body him a lot. So does he get frustrated by, using that derriere a little bit or a hip or a little bow, trying to get a little bit of position? That'll be interesting to see. So what kind of chance do you give them getting through the weekend and getting to New Orleans?
I had in my bracket, believe it or not, everybody's still alive. I had Gonzaga. I had Arizona. I was pretty secure about those. I had Kansas. I didn't want to take 3 number ones because I thought it would be wide open. But Kansas is not a team really I wanted to take. I got a lot of confidence in, but they were in their weakest region. And so I just looked at it and I said, I just don't see anybody in there that can beat them. So, I had that. Then I had Purdue beating Kentucky in the Sweet 16. And then I had I had that. And I had actually Purdue coming out on that side and winning the region. So that's what I kind of went with. I think the road, honestly, playing St. Peter's gets a little bit easier. St. Peter's gets into this second weekend. They get a chance to kind of withdraw.
Enjoy it.
Yeah. Purdue's so much bigger, and they got depth on the inside. I think the winner of UCLA and North Carolina plays Purdue. And like I said, it could very well be North Carolina. I think the pressure's on UCLA. I really do, because I just think North Carolina can score easier. And I always like the team that can do that. I think when you've got one team that can get into the 70s and 80s a little bit and still defend, and you've got another team that plays it in the 50s and 60s, if this thing gets above if this thing gets above 60, every point it gets above 65 points, I think North Carolina's maybe 70. I think they've got the advantage. So
they can make shots when they're well defended, because all they have to do is have one pass, one cut, one screen, one pop out. After 20 seconds of really good defense, they can still score. They can demoralize. I've seen them they demoralize the out of Marquette early because they were making shots when it looked like they were being well defended.
North Carolina's red hot right now offensively, and I'll say this. I'll throw the gauntlet down right here. North Carolina scores over 70, they win.
By the way, my Final Four, I only have Gonzaga left. I had Gonzaga beating Wisconsin in the finals because I thought a lot of stuff would happen. I also had Tennessee and Kentucky. And I must not have listened to you at all when you were talking about the Wildcats.
Wisconsin, no, and I see that. I had Purdue beating the Sweet 16.
I did, and by the way, I did my bracket in like 18 minutes. I did it for my brother on ESPN or something like that. I do one a year like that.
If I put any thought into it, I probably wouldn't have any teams left in it at all. So, but Wisconsin's kind of like UCLA. I said, I had Iowa State going to the Sweet 16, and the reason I did was because I said, look, I don't have any confidence in Wisconsin, who's going to get in the NCAA tournament, score 50. And UCLA is a little bit better than that. And look, here I am knocking the team at 6-1 in the NCAA tournament the last 2 years. But like I said, I just feel like a team can score on them. They can be had. Then you get in Purdue game, man. I just think I'm sticking with Purdue coming out. I just think Purdue's complete. And I know that
they don't defend though.
I know. And I'm picking a guy who has not been to the Final Four. I understand that. But so I'm putting eggs in an unproven basket there. I still, though, I like this. I just think Jaden Ivey's a difference maker. And you've got some monsters inside. You got guys that can hit the three. Man, I agree. I just love Jaden Ivey.
That program has knocked on the door so much since Joe Barry Carroll was there 40 years ago, and I think it might be their time. Very quickly,
they've not had anybody in the Purdue They've not had anybody in the Purdue program like Jaden Ivey since Glenn Robinson.
I agree.
I know.
And Glenn Robinson almost got them to a Final Four.
And I know that's a different position. We're talking about a guard compared to a guy with 6'10", 6'11". But, man, he just has that type of impact.
And Ivy, I think, has better personnel around him than Glenn Robinson did. By the way, you mentioned Iowa State. 2-22 a year, 2 wins a year ago. They're in the Sweet 16 now. Oregon State in a regional final. Last year, they won 3 games this year. That's how awesome college basketball is. Okay, so, David, I'm not going to go out on a limb for the whole weekend right now. I think North Carolina is going to beat UCLA because I think that they're just going to make enough shots to win that game. I would have a very difficult time right now picking North Carolina to beat Purdue for the reasons you just stated. I also just think that when I saw Purdue in person a couple of times, and this is way back in November, that looked like a national championship team to me. I've covered a lot of teams in person that were national championship teams, and they were dripping of national championship goods because they could score all kinds of ways. And they've got that size, they've got experience. And like you said, man, there's nobody in the country like Jaden Ivey. Nobody like Jaden Ivey. He's the one guy out there that just kind of gives them a dimension nobody else has. I think a really cool national title game would be, I don't even know if they're in the same bracket or not right now. Purdue and Gonzaga, I think, would be a fascinating game. An absolutely fascinating game. Neither team is awesome defensively, but they got a crap load of parts offensively.
Let me ask you this. Would you give North Carolina a better chance of beating Purdue than UCLA?
Oh, I think they have who would I pick to beat Purdue?
No, let me ask you this. Because I've done said, well, we've made our pick here. But I've kind of based it on, in my original bracket, I had UCLA and Purdue playing in the region finals. Okay. And I had Purdue beating UCLA. But let me ask you this. I'm kind of basing it on that. If North Carolina beats UCLA, would you give them a better shot against Purdue than you would give UCLA against Purdue?
Yes, because they can score. Because they I think maybe more than any team in this tournament. I've been telling you for a while they're built to make a run in the tournament because they've got 4 different guys who could go off for 25 on a given night, and they do it all differently. It's not like you could say, like against a team that's great throwing the ball but can't run. Well, if we could just cut this receiver off a little bit, then we'll really strangle the passing game. With North Carolina, you've got Baycott, who's uniquely different from Manick, who's uniquely different from RJ, who is very different from Caleb. And then that glue guy in there doing all his stuff, who, by the way, Leaky had 13 assists in Fort Worth. So I think they're extremely difficult to guard. They might not be the best. They're not the best offensive team. I still think that's probably Gonzaga, but they're an extremely difficult team for teams to guard, because you're going to basically have to say, well, we've got to focus on this first, which means you may be letting up on something else, which is why I think your point about UCLA, they've got to maybe abandon some of the things they do, because they just have to play straight up and hope they can win those battles. I think that's a tough challenge when you go up against Carolina the way they're playing right now.
I can draw you a blueprint for North Carolina beating either one of these teams. And, of course, I know we're leaving St. Peter's out, but we're just assuming it's going to be
not going to happen.
Purdue and UCLA, I can draw the blueprint because, like you say, Purdue doesn't defend relatively well. So the way you got to think, if North Carolina beats UCLA, the confidence is going to be through the roof, and you'd have to think, hey, if they beat UCLA, they've made some shots to do it. So then, like I said, you've got a hot shooting team coming in this thing that's full of confidence, going against a really good offensive team, but a team that is not necessarily strong defensively. I just don't, no matter what happened earlier in the year, I don't think that's a matchup that North Carolina would be afraid of. Probably one.
Well, you know what? They're different than they were, because Dawson Garcia had 26 points that game. That was his coming out party. Mm-hmm. He hit a three that put Carolina up 66-65, and then Purdue kind of took over after that. But Purdue would have to prepare for a team they didn't see in November. If that matchup happens, Carolina would prepare for a team that's a lot like they were in November. Yeah. So that'll be very interesting. David, it's always a blast. I think we have set a new record for longest podcast ever in the history of Tar Heel.
It's that time of year, man. Would you rather talk about this, or would you rather talk about a road game at Boston College?
Well, that road game at Boston College, that was a phenomenal environment. When that guy up in Section C was yelling, I was rattled. That guy in Section C, right?
Yeah.
Hey, that was a good trip, because I went up a day early because of the original time when the game was supposed to be, and that's when I got my New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont in, and I got Oklahoma in last week. So I'm at 44 states now.
Yeah. Hey Jones, where'd you park your car?
Oh, geez. You couldn't pay me enough money to live up there. No offense to the great people up there. Wonderful history. I'm not going to say anything about the baseball team, because you guys know where my allegiance is. It's right back there. So I got two more weeks till those guys start losing. 2.5 weeks, they start losing every game. So, all right, man. It's always a blast. It's always a pleasure talking hoops with you, my friend.
You too, buddy. Enjoyed it.
All right. He's David. I'm AJ. We appreciate you stopping by.